Welcome. This is a summary for the latest research that's being published at the end of August for the Dynamic Coast project. This video covers the following points: an introduction, context, methods, results, implications, and our next steps. The Scottish Government's Dynamic Coast project was funded by CREW, the Centre of Expertise for Waters, NatureScot and St Andrews Links Trust, with the research conducted by a team at the University of Glasgow. The picture on the right also shows the logos for our partners, and we're grateful for their support throughout the project. The Dynamic Coast project aims to improve the evidence on coastal change in Scotland, improve the awareness of the impacts of coastal change in Scotland, and to support decision makers to ensure Scotland's coast and assets can flexibly adapt to our future climate. This slide provides some context to the work and a timeline on the left-hand side. Prior to 2015, Scotland's coastal erosion problem was devolved to local authorities and landowners, relying on inaccurate legacy data in many cases, with limited national awareness of the future implications of coastal erosion. Over the last 7 years, Dynamic Coast has driven huge improvements in science and governance. Arguably, in many areas, we've turned from laggards to leaders. Like many countries, our risk appraisal shows that past approaches aren't going to be enough. Put simply, in a changing world, business as usual will fail. Dynamic Coast is a game changer, delivering a step change in awareness, but improvements in delivery and action are now required to realise these benefits. So what methods have we used in the project? We've incorporated a lot of new survey data. Since 2015, some 6,000 kilometres of new and updated shoreline information has been available. So some of this is from work done by the Ordnance Survey, and some of this is work done by the Scottish Government's LiDAR campaign. These new data and a better understanding of those data sets have been used alongside new equations, new formulae to better understand the relationship of sea level rise on future coastal change. We've taken the sea level rise estimates from UKCP 18 for a high, medium and low emission scenario and used those to guide and to scale up the recent changes that have experienced on our coastline over the last few years and few decades, and scale those up according to that extra sea level that we anticipate in the coming years based on a low, high or medium emission scenario. The map on the right hand side shows some of the results. These are decadal or 10-year intervals of where we anticipate erosion to extend to under a high emission scenario. So you can see the current shoreline shown in the air photography, and the red lines getting increasingly dark for each of the decades stretching out towards 2100. We've also been able to include the extent of coastal defences within this modelling, and that allows us to, as is shown in this image, allow a little bit of erosion where we have coastal defences. That allows us to understand what happens if we don't maintain artificial defences. But then we can also capture those areas again within the accounting and remove them so that we can then get an impression of what happens if we maintain our existing artificial coastal defences. Of course, sea levels rise. They're rising at the moment, and they're expected to rise for a continuing period. So the graph at the bottom shows the anticipated sea level rise. This is global sea level rise up to 2300. So you can see that sea levels are expected to rise under all emission scenarios, and we'll come back to that point later on. We've also explored the relationship between erosion and flooding to better understand erosion-enhanced flooding. As you can see from some pictures here of Golspie, some of our coast is actually quite busy. There's a lot of us living here and using the roads and shops and businesses that are clustered along parts of our shoreline. During storms, erosion can occur and flooding can occur, and it affects the infrastructure and the communities in those areas. The A9 runs through Golspie. That's a main trunk road linking in different parts of the country. And you can also imagine there's a lot of infrastructure as far as water supply, telecommunications, electricity and such like. Some of our coast is actually really quite busy, and it's important for us to understand the assets in these locations and the risks posed to them. We've also incorporated other data sets to try and improve or get a richer understanding of the changes going on. The map on the, or the photograph on the left-hand side actually is a satellite image that has been automatically analysed by some colleagues at the Ordnance Survey to find the edge of the vegetation, where the terrestrial vegetation stops and where bare sand, in this example at St Andrews, starts. If we can do this repeatedly, as we now can, then we can build up a picture of how the vegetation edge has changed through time, and then compare that with high water and low water changes. This work has been followed up by colleagues at NatureScot, exploring air photography to see how the air photography back catalogue can be used in a similar way. It's obviously got a better resolution than satellite imagery, and we've got a lot of it stretching back over the last 20 or 30 or so years. We can supplement this analysis by ground survey, as shown on the picture on the right-hand side. Another colleague at NatureScot at the National Nature Reserve at St Cyrus undertaking a vegetation edge survey. So altogether, these data sets give us a richer understanding of changes and the signal-to-noise ratio that we should expect on our coast. Alongside the national work, we've also looked in detail in a few locations, in 6 super sites, if you like. These are exemplars of how the work can be enriched and then used to better inform local decision making. In this case, colleagues at Angus Council standing on one of the sand dunes shown in the pictures on the right hand side. You can see through the 3-dimensional model and the maps that the sand dunes have gaps within them, potential flood corridors. Now, what we've been able to do is analyse these digital terrain models, these height surfaces, and see which bits are where the dunes are fat, healthy and big, and which areas are narrow, weak and low, to see how flooding may affect these areas at different flood altitudes. What we can then do on the right-hand side is consider how erosion, the red line shown on the map, how erosion will potentially cut across those features into the future, and then consider the shelf life, if you like, of those features going forward. We can also then consider, if we wanted to fill up these gaps, what different scenarios we could deploy and how much sediment would be required. And an additional area of work that we've managed to do this time, it looks into social disadvantage. So in the same way that erosion, we've looked at erosion and how that may affect different bits of infrastructure, we're now able for the first time to compare that using different data sets about social vulnerability, to consider the overlap between erosion and social vulnerability. And you can see the heat map, the little this brown stripe around the coast, which shows you the areas of greatest social disadvantage from coastal erosion. In addition to this, you can also see some work we've done looking in using novel satellite monitoring. One of the problems of coastal change detection is there's a lot of coast, and using traditional techniques, it's really quite expensive. However, some new research that we've undertaken allows us to explore the back catalogue of satellite images that have been collected by the Sentinel-2 satellite. These have been analysed to find areas of water. Now, obviously, the sea's always wet, the land is always dry, and the intertidal area is sometimes wet and sometimes dry. By building up a picture of which of these pixels within each of the satellite images is wet and dry, we're able to get an extent of the foreshore. And as you can see from the image on the right hand side with the tide rising and falling, we're able to stack the altitudes based on the anticipated tide level within at each time the satellite image was taken, to get a sense of the intertidal topography. Whilst the data sets are quite coarse, they do provide very important change detection, and the benefits comes in the scalability. So we now have this data not just for the image at St Andrews that you see on the screen, but we have this for the whole of Scotland, England, Wales, and the island of Ireland. And you can see that on the web maps. Whilst our full results are available in report form within dynamiccoast.com, this slide provides a quick summary. Erosion is affecting more of our open coast than historically, and also since we last looked at this in 2017. Now, the footprint of the analysis, where we've actually looked, has changed since the 2017 work, but resampling that data, we can see the extent of, or the areas of shore that are experiencing erosion has increased from the work in 2017 at 38% to now at 46%. The speed at which erosion is also happening, as is shown in the graph bar chart at Montrose, is also increasing. And we should anticipate that to continue into the future. And this is the line graphs in the middle of the left-hand side of the screen. The rate and extent of erosion increases for all scenarios, for the low, high, and medium emission scenarios. And that's because of past emissions that we're still experiencing. When we look around the coast, there's a lot of assets there. There's £20 billion worth of assets within 50 metres of our soft and artificial coasts. Interestingly, when we break that down, 3/4 or £14.5 billion worth of assets are protected by nature's defences, by our sand dunes and our salt marshes. That's compared with £5 billion behind artificial defences like the seawall show. Now, if we project the erosion forward on a high emission scenario, which is the current pathway that the world's on, and if we don't maintain those defences, then £1.2 billion worth of assets are at risk in the next 30 years by 2050. However, for a low emissions pathway, if we manage to quickly get down to net zero under the terms of the Paris Agreement, then we can save ourselves £400 million worth of damages. We can also, as we alluded to in the last slide, we can now also consider the coastal erosion disadvantage across Scotland. Now, it is uneven, but it can be incorporated into our thinking for the first time. What are the implications of this? Achieving net zero will save assets, management and repair costs, livelihoods and possibly even lives. It is an act of self-interest, but on its own it's not going to be enough. Why? Because of the substantial time lag between now to net zero and beyond, we will see sea level rise and coastal erosion impacting more of our coast, whatever the climate scenario. As you can see from the graph on the right hand side, we are here, shown by the arrow, and Montrose is given as an example. The high emission scenario stretches with higher sea levels over the rest of the century. And you can see even the low emission scenario shown in the blue areas is above where our current sea level is at the moment at Montrose, but also more generally across Scotland is even above where they are too. So under a high emissions scenario, we should anticipate up to between 25 and 46 centimetres by 2050, and this raises to expecting at least, up to 86 centimetres or 1 metre 21 by 2100. There are lower figures shown on the slide as well. Now, whilst these may appear to be small numbers, 25 centimetres by 2050, for example, that 25 centimetres of sea level rise increases flood frequency from a 1 in 10 year event to a 1 in 1 year event. So it might be a small number, but it's an angry number. This leads us to think about the relationship between mitigation and adaptation. John Holdren, one of President Obama's scientific advisors, summarized this quite nicely. He said, basically, we have three choices: mitigation, adaptation, and suffering. We're going to do some of each. The question is, what is the mix going to be? The more mitigation we do, the less adaptation will be required and the less suffering there will be. So, irrespective of and in addition to future greenhouse gas reductions, new approaches are required. We need a national coastal monitoring programme to keep up to date with the changes that are going on in our shoreline. We need adaptive shoreline management plans to plan our future management approach along our shoreline. These need to then support joined up and funded short-term resilience and longer-term adaptation actions. We need to recognise the scale of challenge to ensure that our planning system can secure coastal adaptation space to allow the shore and the assets behind to move inland. We need to consider social disadvantage to ensure a just transition. We must avoid development lock-ins, and lastly and importantly, invest in both our natural and artificial defences. So what are the next steps? We need to increase awareness and support the use of Dynamic Coast. And to that end, I'm very grateful for the support of Michael Matheson, the Cabinet Secretary from the Scottish Government, but also, and crucially, our local authorities, Angus Council shown here, but also all the other coastal authorities around the country. Their role is absolutely crucial in taking this forward. Our work is publicly available on dynamiccoast.com and is available for businesses, communities and the public alike. We also need to maintain and improve our evidence base. Scotland is the only home nation without a funded coastal monitoring programme, and that appears at odds from the evidence that we have before us. We need to promote adaptive shoreline management plans, and guidance is underway and a rollout is expected based on the results from this research. We need to coordinate and deliver adaptive shoreline management plans collaboratively and flexibly via resilience and adaptation actions. And improvements are needed to our adaptation planning, collaboration and funding. All of this together will enable us to become sea level wise. Lastly, I'd like to give my thanks to our funders, the Scottish Government, Crew, NatureScot and St Andrews Links Trust. Also like to thank our partners shown on the screen here as well. Without their support, their expertise and their encouragement, we wouldn't end up with the results as we do, all available on dynamiccoast.com. I'd also like to thank the research team led by Jim Hansom at the University of Glasgow. They've worked under some very, very challenging conditions through lockdown, and I'm incredibly grateful for their efforts. I'd also like to thank those people for the broader Dynamic Coast team shown on the slide as well, who have helped us through our steering group, and I'm indebted to their expertise and their contributions. All of our results are available now on dynamiccoast.com. Should you have any questions, please feel free to email us on dynamiccoast@nature.scot or follow us on Twitter @dynamiccoasts. Thank you very much.